Welcome back to this tutorial. In this one we are going to cover some very important topics. We're going to get into the legal responsibilities under the ILO convention, which is the C155 convention, and also something called a recommendation, which is R164. I'll explain the difference between the two very, very shortly. But first, let's start with an exercise. So can you remember which of the following statements are true? Right, two of those were correct. So firstly, an international convention does not create a legal duty which applies to an organization. Organizations answer to the national government, not the ILO. What the convention does, it does create a legal duty for member states to create the legislation. So if the member state has signed it and agreed to comply with the international treaty, they must create a national law which implements that treaty. And as for the recommendations, well, we haven't really spoken much about the recommendations yet, although they have been covered in the written materials. The recommendation does not create any legal duties. They are recommendations, the clues in the words there. They are advisory, they are guidance. So what is a recommendation? Well, let's take a look at them, shall we? We, in the last tutorial, looked at the C155 convention. So this is an international treaty. What is the recommendation? Well, let's go for R164 ILO. This recommendation is basically recommendations to help implement the C155 convention. You see, the C155 convention can be a bit vague in exactly how you should comply with the law. So it gives some very broad duties. We're going to take a look at those duties in a moment. It's a bit vague. The recommendation creates advice on what exactly you should do to comply with those broad duties. Here we are. Here are the employer duties under C155. Now, I have maybe rephrased these very slightly, but what it does is that it requires the member country, so it requires the government to create its own national legislation to have these duties. So in my legislation, we have the Health and Safety at Work Act here in the UK. And in our Health and Safety at Work Act, we have well, at least two of these. We have this duty here to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the workplaces, machinery, equipment and processes are under our control, are safe and without risk to health. We've got that in our Act. Slightly different words, but we've mostly got it. And then we've got this one here about the controlling the chemical, physical and biological substances. Now, that is dealt with in the Act, but we've also got some other legislation as well called the COSH regulations which deal with that. And this final one here is about protective clothing and protective equipment, and to that extent that's covered by a few different laws, including some PPE regulations. So my UK legislation created by my government implements C155. Isn't it interesting? We've done that. And yet we haven't signed the treaty. The United Kingdom has not signed the treaty, and yet we've still kind of done it anyway. So just because the UK has not signed the treaty does not necessarily mean that the UK doesn't care about health and safety. No, I think we've actually gone way, way further than what the treaty required. Right, so let's take a look at the actual legislation itself. This is C155, the convention. So again, we've got the preamble, the scope, we've got what it requires from governments, national level. Blah, blah, blah. Here we are, action at the level of the undertaking. So the undertaking, this is the employer's duties, what the employer has to do, what the organization has to do. Article 16, we've got these three duties here. Employers shall be required to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, and we're going to talk about what that means later. You've got to ensure that the workplaces, machinery, equipment and processes under their control are safe and without risk to health. So under their control. Now that's interesting, isn't it? It's like you're only responsible for the things under your control, which makes sense. You know, I was delivering training recently for a big employer who worked on other sites, so places which were not under their control. So they were working in train stations and subway stations and bus stations and airports. They didn't own the train stations or the airports, they were just contracted to those places. So they had no control over those places. And so they are not responsible for the safety of the workplace, the safety of the equipment or the machinery in that workplace. They were only responsible for their own stuff. And they didn't have a lot of stuff. The owner of the airport is in control of the airport, obviously, and it's the owner of the airport who is responsible for the safety of that workplace. So for example, if the workplace is super untidy, right, is the owner of that workplace, the person who's in control of it, who is responsible for that. Now there might be a situation where the airport is not in control of a section of the airport. There may be a section of it, it could be an office, maybe an office given to the police, maybe there's an office given to the border or immigration controls or something, and that is managed and under the control of the police, not the airport owner. Now, if that environment is unsafe, if there are processes in there, or say X-ray scanners and things like that, if there's stuff in there which is unsafe, that would be the responsibility of the company in control. In this case, the police force, not the owner of the airport. The other duty here was about the chemical, physical, and biological substances. So chemicals. Now, just to clarify what this means, chemicals, that we're going to talk about chemicals much later in the course. This could be liquids, fumes, powders, dusts, cleaning materials, alcohols, solvents, all that kind of thing. Biological substances, that could be things like viruses and bacteria, parasites, funguses. So this is often like healthcare, laboratory situations, but also it could just be bodily fluids. It could be bloods, feces, urine, poo, that kind of thing. So you might have a cleaning activity where you have to clean up after people and so on, clean up after injured people. You have to make sure those substances are dealt with in a safe way. And it also could include things like towels and plasters, bandages, knives, syringes, needles and things. They have to be dealt with in a safe way. But it says here physical. Physical's a bit different. Physical could relate to things like noise, and vibration, and radiation, maybe temperature as well. So we've got these physical hazards which can also cause risks to health. And notice, look at the language. We've got safe in this one here, and we've got health. We've got two different things, safety and health and safety. They are actually two different things. Safety is about preventing injuries, broken bones, things which go bang and break you immediately. Health is about diseases, conditions, things which appear gradually, most of the time. Not always. Asbestosis appears very gradually. Skin cancer, gradually. Flu bacteria, it can take a week or two for the flu to develop inside. But there are some health conditions which do appear instantly, and so certain chemicals in your eyes will cause damage immediately and so on. So we'll talk about that a bit later, the difference between those two. Here we've got the protective clothing duty here. We've got some more duties too. We've got other things here. It says it talks about where undertakings engage two different undertakings, so two different employers at the same time in one workplace. They've got to collaborate. So the airport and the police in the airport and the cleaning company and the security company and the baggage handling company and all of the other companies, the airlines, the catering, all of them have all got to collaborate to keep each other safe and the public safe. What else is in here? Article 18, employers shall be required to provide, where necessary, measures to deal with emergencies and accidents, including first aid. And then we've got some other duties in here. We'll talk about those in a moment because they relate to employees. So those are the employer duties under C155. They're just the three big ones. Do not forget, though, the Article 17, Article 18. If you were asked a broad question in the exam, what duties of the employer were under C155 have been breached in this scenario, you would obviously use, say, Article 16, 17 and 18. You could use all of those. They may or may not be relevant. You might have to think of, there might be lots of different ways in which 16.1 has been breached. There might be an issue with the workplace. Maybe there's a wall that's falling down and could fall on someone. Maybe there's a machine which is unguarded and has some dangerous parts. Maybe there's some equipment which has a faulty electrical cable on it. Maybe there's a process, like a maintenance process, which is unsafe and people could get sucked into a machine. So there might be lots of different breaches for that one requirement there. And again, there might be lots of different breaches for the chemical, physical and biological substances and agents too. So you might get a 10-mark question asking what are the breaches of C155, duties of employers, in this scenario. Comment on those. And so you would have to you would have to say, right, we're breaching this duty and this is what they're doing, that's why it's a breach. You have to explain the breach. Don't just say, oh, it's untidy. Oh, the conveyor's broken. Oh, they haven't got the right PPE. It's like, that doesn't explain anything. Any idiot can point out a problem. Don't just point out problems. Explain how those problems are breaking these laws in C155 convention. If you're watching this and you're a NEBOSH student, did you know that you have a ton of resources on the Compassa website which you can use? Many of them are very, very cheap. You've got our YouTube section here, loads of free advice here, but if you want some study books, if you want exam technique documents, exam technique guides, instructions on how to do your NG2 or IG2 practical project, you can download those at some very, very reasonable prices from our website. And if you wanted hands-on tutor support with full access to all of our tutorials, guides, me and my colleagues at the tips of your fingers, consider signing up for our NEBOSH Rescue package. You'll get access to our full course and tutor support at a heavily discounted rate. And, well, frankly, you'll struggle to find pass rates that are as consistently high anywhere else. Let's get back to the advice. Now let's look at that recommendation R164. So here we have quite a long list. Notice that, look, it's a big list of the employer duties. Now these have been rephrased for simplicity. It's well worth looking at what the law actually says. So let's go to R1664. So there we are, I've opened it. Again, not a super interesting read. Action at the national level. Yeah, we're not interested in that. We're looking at action at the level of the undertaking, part 4. Now this, remember, is guidance. It's a recommendation. How do you comply with those more general duties? And so we've got various things, obligations placed on employers with a view to achieving the objectives set forth in Article 16 of the Convention. What was Article 16? Go back up there. It was these 3 things. So it's recommendations to implement these objectives. So that's just an objective. How do you complete the objective though? Well, by doing these things. And it talks here about providing and maintaining workplace machine equipment which are safe and without risk to health, giving instructions and training, taking account of the functions and capacities of different categories of workers. So different training for different people depending on what they do and their different capacities. Providing supervision of work, the work practices, and the use and application of health and safety measures. We want organizational arrangements regarding health and safety, and also in regards to the working environment. And those arrangements should be adapted to the size of the undertaking. So big organizations, complicated organizations should have bigger and more complicated arrangements. It also says adapted to the nature of its activities. So the nature, what does it do? Well, it might be construction, it might be petrochemical, it might be oil and gas, or it might be a shop. You have different levels of risk, different levels of complexity. The higher the risk, the greater the amount of effort is expected to manage that. It talks about providing without any cost to the worker the PPE and equipment necessary. It talks about work organization, in particular with respect to the hours of work and rest breaks. They want to make sure that the way work is organized, in particular around working hours and shifts and breaks, do not affect health and safety and health. So you don't want to make people, say, so overworked that they lose concentration, they get tired, they're not careful anymore. You don't want to work them so hard and so fast that they're rushing like crazy and making mistakes. They don't have time to tidy up. You know, you want to make sure that work is organized so that you're not creating a risk from how it's organized. That also means stress as well. You don't want to organize work to make it inherently stressful. Take all reasonably practical measures with a view to eliminating excessive physical and mental fatigue. The key word there is excessive. There's going to be some physical fatigue. There's going to be some mental fatigue. Lord knows I am mentally fatigued. NEBOSH is hard, but it can't be excessive. And then it also talks about undertaking studies and research to keep abreast of scientific and technical knowledge necessary. Yes, okay, so technology and science is progressing. There are new systems, new technologies, new applications on phones, new software, new cool stuff we can do to keep people safe. And so it requires that employers stay up to date on the current best way of managing health and safety. And it's got some more in there. But if you look at this list here, this is a nice summary of what have we got. What have we not mentioned? We've not mentioned the records of accidents. So we are required to keep records of accidents and incidents. We are required to follow the hierarchy of control instead of, now we're going to talk about the hierarchy of control later. You might not be familiar with that yet, but basically it means that we should control hazards in a way which is effective. Don't just use PPE for everything. PPE is not effective. We should inspect the workplace and make sure standards are followed. Don't just create a rule, enforce the rule. Check the rule is being followed, act if the rule is not being followed. Simple as that. That is required under R164. We should have a health and safety policy down here. There should be consultation, worker participation, communication between managers and workers, and usually we do that through a system of representatives. And so we go back to C155, you'll see there's a mention of representatives here, worker reps. We're going to talk about worker reps later in the course when we talk about consultation and participation. There we are. So broadly, those are the employer duties. Now you could get asked exam questions on that. Asked you, in this scenario, what are the breaches of the employer's duties under C155? Or R164, or both. Maybe both are included. We'll see. On that note, let's do a quick exercise, shall we? So here's a really short case study. Read this and then select which of the employer duties of C155 have been breached. And remember to scroll down if you can't see the full answer. Okay, so firstly, there's a bit of a trick question in there. So some of the answers were actually R164 duties. So you may have selected those by accident, thinking, oh yeah, that's a duty. That must be right. No. The question says C155, which means that only, if this was a NEBOSH exam, you get caught out there. So if the NEBOSH question says what duties under C155 have been breached, only the C155 duties will get marks. The R164 duties are out of bounds, and vice versa. If the question says what R164 duties have been breached, then C155 is out of bounds. Maybe the question includes both. I've seen questions like that. It says what C155 and what R164 employer duties have been breached. Big 10 mark, 15 mark question. Let's move on now to worker responsibilities, because workers do have responsibilities too under both C155 and R164. And C155 requires that workers, or it requires actually that national governments create laws to require workers to cooperate with their employer, with a view to enabling their employer to comply with their own duties. So essentially, we have to follow the employer's rules. The employer creates rules to comply with their duties. We have to follow those rules as employees. That's in C155. Let's take a look at C155. There shall be arrangements at the level of the undertaking, and it talks here about the cooperate in the fulfillment by their employer of the obligations placed upon him. Fair enough. And then there's quite a bit of talk here about the representatives and things that should be provided. Anyway, R164 provides a bit more detail about what workers are supposed to do. What are they required to do? So let's take a look at that. There they are. So the arrangements provided for in Article 19 of the Convention. So Article 19, just to be clear, it's this one here. All right, so to comply with that, the arrangements should aim at ensuring that workers take reasonable care for their own safety. You might have a scenario where workers are not taking reasonable care of their own safety. They're taking risks. Maybe they are not wearing the PPE that they're supposed to wear. So they are required to take reasonable care for their own safety and that of other persons who may be affected by their acts or omissions. So acts or omissions, so it's by what they do and what they fail to do. It's like, well, you should do something, but you fail to do it. So we should report a near miss. We should report a hazard, but we don't. Don't bother. Can't be bothered. I've reported that loads of times. Not gonna bother. That's not gonna hurt anybody. And then, well, that hazard then hurts somebody. That near miss happens again, and it's an accident this time. So we are required to take reasonable care of ourselves and others who could be affected. Other things is to comply with the instructions that we are given for our own safety and that of others. So you might have a scenario where people are given training, given instructions, but they ignore it. They do something different. They are required to use safety devices and protective equipment correctly. Right, so PPE must be worn correctly. Safety devices, guards, machines, controls, emergency stop buttons. They should be used correctly. Do not render them inoperative. Do not remove the guard. Do not bypass the interlock switch. Do not turn off the fire system because you're going to do some welding or grinding. Do not render these things inoperative. Do not sabotage the fire extinguisher for fun. Not a good idea. It says report forthwith, so report quickly. That's what that means. Report quickly to their immediate supervisor any situation which they have reason to believe could present a hazard and which they cannot themselves correct. Which you can't correct. So if you see a hazard and you can fix it yourself, oh, there's a cable, I'll pick that up. Oh, there's a box, I'll pick that up. They can fix some things themselves. But if there's anything I can't do myself, that's broken and I can't fix it. That's so untidy I can't do that myself. We have to report these things to our immediate supervisor. And lastly, it says report any accident or injury to health which arises in the course or in connection with work. So that is all summarized here in slightly different wording, simplified wording. On your NEBOSH exam, I do recommend, if you can, use the correct wording. Try and use the correct wording here. So you could say that the employee, the worker, has breached their duty to take reasonable care for their own safety and that of others who could be affected by their acts or omissions, because this employee decided to not replace their respirator, even though they knew the respirator was clogged up with dust or whatever, and therefore they knowingly exposed themselves to the chemical. Can you see how that works? It's like, here's the duty, here's what they did, and this is why it's a breach of that duty. That's kind of the level of detail you have to get to on a NEBOSH examination. Let's do an exercise here. Again, I've got a case study, and I would like you to read this case study. Again, it's a little bit long, lots of answers. Scroll down to the bottom if you cannot see the full answer. Read the case study and tell me which worker responsibilities under R164 have been breached. Okay, so in that one, there wasn't a trick question. All of those duties were R164 duties. There were no C155 duties hidden in there. But you did notice one of them was not breached. It was the duty to report accidents or injuries to health. Now, the scenario talked about the reporting of near misses which had gone unreported, but there was no information on a lack of accident reporting. So I couldn't honestly say that they had breached that duty. They had failed to report near misses, but they hadn't failed to report the accidents. Moving on to the last topic on this is workers' rights. Workers do have rights under C155 and R164. Here we've got a nice summary of the rights. So workers have a right to information about what's being done to keep them safe. So they have a right to be told what are the controls, the processes, the rules, the precautions that are in place to keep you safe. The workers have a right to receive adequate training. For example, they have a right to be inducted, so training at the start of their employment, and then refresher training or various topic training, hazard training, equipment training as required. They have a right to be consulted and involved in health and safety discussions. So we'll talk about consultation later, but consultation is basically where an employer wants to make changes or do something. Workers have a right to be consulted on those changes where those changes might affect health and safety. Again, we'll talk about that later in the course, but that consultation may go through a work representative and not directly through the worker. Finally, workers do have a right, well, you could argue it's a duty as well, to be fair, a moral duty. You have a right to stop work if there is a serious and imminent danger, if there's a stop work and leave the workplace. When I say serious and imminent danger, I'm on about potential death, potential disablement, serious injury. So they have a right to go. Now, if you wanted to read the wording of those rights for yourself, you'll find it in C155, Article 19, and where is it? So what is it? So there shall be arrangements at the level of the undertaking under which representatives of workers are given adequate information. Workers and their representatives are given appropriate training. Workers or their representatives are consulted by the employer on various rights, essentially a right to information, a right to training, and a right to be consulted, and also the right to stop work and leave if there's imminent danger. Let's do one final activity just to close this off. So there's going to be a series of questions asking you essentially, who does this duty belong to? Does it belong to the employer, the worker, or the government? So please read the duty, select the correct answer. Okay, so hopefully that's helping you summarize a little bit the different duties that apply to different parties. In this next exercise, I'd like to do a little bit of a drag and drop exercise. I would like you to match the breach or the situation against the correct employer duty. So all of those were C155 employer duties, very broad duties, the duty to ensure the safety of workplace equipment processes and so on. There's a duty about the chemical, physical, biological agents, and there's a duty about the PPE, protective equipment and clothing and so on. When you do your NEBOSH exam, you may be asked questions where you have to comment on the breaches of C155 or R164, and you're going to have to talk about here's the duty, and here's what's going on in the scenario, and I think this bit here breaches that duty, and here's why. Yeah, so you're gonna have to write that out in a couple of lines, 2 to 3 lines. And if it's a 10-mark question, yeah, you might have to have 10 to 15 different breaches, each one 2 to 3 lines. Anyway, there we are. That's enough for all of that. I will, please, as usual, always go through your written materials, do your quizzes and so on, and I'll see you in the very next tutorial, which hopefully will be the final tutorial on law.